Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes renting fast if you're the car chick. Now, here she is.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Straight Shift. We are headed into spring, which means two things. Number one, it's raining. And it's been raining, I think, nearly every day for the past 2 months. I swear, any day now, somebody is going to call me and ask help buying an ARC. We seriously need one. But the other thing it means is that we're heading into what I like to call cheap used car buying season. I call it that because traditionally around March, April, even into early May, a lot of people will choose to use their tax refund to purchase an inexpensive used car, either for themselves or perhaps for their teenager. So this time of year, a lot of people are buying cheap used cars, which I define as any used car under $5,000. Now, that might seem like $5,000 is pretty expensive. But in the used car market today, really anything under $5,000 is considered very, very inexpensive. If you haven't noticed, cars are really dang expensive now. So as a result, the used car prices are also higher. But there's a couple other things that have affected used car prices over the years. One of the biggest ones, if you guys remember, I think it was about 10 years ago, we had a lot of things going on in the economy. We had the financial markets crash. There was the whole, crap going on in the mortgage industry with a lot of fraud. And as a result, we ended up in a recession. And the government, because the American car manufacturers were struggling, mostly due to their own mistakes, but we had to bail them out. But one of the things that they did was a program called Cash for Clunkers. And this was where if you had an older vehicle and I think it had to, get less than certain gas mileage figure, whatnot. I forget what all the parameters were, but basically you could take your old clunker and you could turn it in and it would be worth a guaranteed X amount of money that the government actually paid for. And as a result, they crushed that car to take it off the market. That was also when the gas prices started shooting up over $3-4 a gallon. So they were also trying to get really bad mileage, gas mileage cars off the road, the gas guzzlers. And so Cash for Clunkers took literally hundreds of thousands of, many of which were perfectly good used cars, off the market. And so when that bottom end of the market was literally whacked out from under our feet, that drove up the prices of every other car that was still out there. You combine that with what was going on in the economy with the recession. A lot of people were trying to downsize. They were trying to get out of the car that they had just bought or leased a couple of years ago to try and get a lower monthly payment. So we saw the demand for, cars under $10,000 really skyrocket. And between that supply and demand and the loss of supply due to Cash for Clunkers, what happened was the pricing in the used car market shifted. So today, here we are 10 years later, what really should be a $2,000 or $3,000 car is a $6,000 car. It really shifted the market that much. And we're starting to see things settle down a little bit, but the repercussions of, 2009, 2010 are going to be felt in the used car industry for many more years to come. So you have to, if you're searching for a cheap used car, and I've had a lot of people recently call me and ask, hey, I have a $2,000 or a $3,000 or a $4,000 budget. I need a cheap, reliable car. And I hate to have to be the bearer of bad news, but I have to give them a reality check and say, there is no such thing as a cheap and reliable used car. You can have cheap or you can have reliable, but it's very rare to find both. And here's why. Because of what happened in the markets and the pricing has shifted, anything under $5,000 these days is going to be either over 10 years old and or over, 100, 120, 150, sometimes over 200,000 miles. And that's just the reality of it. And when vehicles are that old, when they have that many miles on them, there's going to be stuff wrong with them. Now, depending on the make and model and depending on whether or not you're looking for a car or an SUV or a truck or a van, prices are going to vary. Obviously, smaller cars are going to be cheaper than SUVs. If you're looking for, a $2,000 or $3,000 SUV, it's going to have a lot higher miles than if you're looking for a $2,000 or $3,000, little econobox sedan. And it also varies, by make and model. Some cars hold their value more than others, but the reality is nothing you find in that price range is going to be perfect. People have these unrealistic expectations that they can buy a $2,000 car and have it have zero issues. Like they're going to just drive it home and it's not going to need anything. But the reality is, it's going to need at least a few hundred, if not a few $1,000s worth of maintenance and repairs to make it reliable. So when you're shopping for a cheap used car, under $5,000, $6,000, your goal is to find the least crappy car that you can find, one that has been well maintained, but probably still needs some stuff that you can then put a little bit more money into to bring those maintenance and repairs up to date so that at least today it is a reliable car. So many people talk about trying to find, that little old lady car, the car that grandma drove on Sundays and it has low miles. It might be a little bit older, but she didn't drive it very much and she took good care of it, and it's still this great car, but grandma passed away and her family is now getting rid of her car and they're just selling it cheap so they can get rid of it. And there was a time when that was true, and you might still find one of those diamonds in the rough, but the reality is they are few and far between today because people are getting smarter and they're realizing that, even if the car is a little bit older, if it's got low miles, if it's been well maintained and it does run really well, it's worth more money. And people are getting smarter and they are going out there before they list the car on Craigslist or wherever. They're looking at other car values and realizing, oh, okay, wait a minute, CarMax only said they were going to give me $500 for this, but, or a dealership was going to only give them $500 or $1,000, but these cars are actually selling, for $3,000 or $4,000 because they run. So if you do find something that has lower miles and is reliable, you're going to find a price tag that's a little bit higher as well. So, you just have to be realistic and know that anything that you find is going to need some work. Now, the types of things that it's going to need are going to depend on how well it's been maintained, how old it is, how many miles are on it, and what kind of vehicle it is to begin with. You may want to go back, if you haven't listened to my podcast, episode 16 of The Straight Shift, What to Expect as Your Car Ages. That's actually a good podcast to listen to that tells you, at a certain age and a certain mileage, what are the things that typically start to go wrong and require maintenance and repairs? That will give you an idea of what to expect in a used car that you are considering purchasing that is of that age and mileage. Because, just like humans, as cars get older, they just, things go wrong. So be realistic in those expectations. You might see things like, seals and gaskets, any of the rubber parts. Rubber has a shelf life. As it ages, it dries out and it cracks, and that's when your seals and gaskets start to leak. So a car, 7+ years old may have some leaks to it, or leaks could be coming any day now. If it's not leaking today, it might be leaking tomorrow. That's just a reality of a car that's over 7 years old. Suspension components may be starting to wear out. You may start seeing some play, in your ball joints. These are the things that you need to look for when looking at a used car. The timing belts might be due. Timing belts for cars that still have them versus chains, the timing belt can be due anywhere as low as every 60,000 miles to every 100,000 miles, depending on the make and model. So, that's something to expect on an older car. Has that timing belt been done? And you may need to do that. So these are just some things that you need to be aware of so that your expectations are realistic. And I tell people if you have, a $3,000 budget or a $4,000 budget, set aside $1,000 out of that budget for repairs and maintenance and a pre-purchase inspection by a mechanic, which I'll talk about more later. But set aside $1,000 out of your budget. So, if your budget's $3,000, you're really shopping for a $2,000 car, and know that it's going to need a lot of work to make it a good car. If you've got a $3,000 or $4,000 budget, I would still hold aside $1,000 if you can. It'll also help cover, your tax and your tags, the things that you're going to need to do when you register the vehicle. Even dealers selling inexpensive used cars, don't expect that just because you're buying it from a dealer means it's going to be in good shape. Dealers that work in that price range are kind of in a tough situation because they had to buy the car really cheap, and then they have to mark it up so that they make a profit because, they're a business, not a charity. But they can't put too much work into those cars. If they're in a state that has inspections like, say, North Carolina, not that North Carolina inspections are great, but they're better than nothing. The wheel can't be falling off and the cords can't be showing through on the tires, but other than that, it's not much. But, they have to make sure the vehicle passes North Carolina inspection. And some of your cheaper dealers, are a little wishy-washy on the inspections depending on who does it. But, like South Carolina where I live, there are no state inspections. So, literally you can buy something that is totally falling apart and it doesn't matter. You can still register it. And so, be careful depending on what state you're in, but the dealers they can't put too much money in these cars because if they do, they'll add too much to what they have sunk into the car, and then they have to sell it at a higher price, but they can't sell it at that higher price because now they're competing against everybody else selling similar cars that's not doing anything. So it's just, kind of a rock and a hard place for them. So, buying from a dealer is not necessarily going to get you a better quality car. In fact, I argue in many cases, the opposite is true. So if you're shopping for an inexpensive used car, $5,000-$6,000 or less, be realistic in terms of what your expectations are. Chances are that car may have been in an accident. Just make sure it's not a really bad accident, but a small accident, a little fender bender here and there, that may be realistic. The car, may not be perfect. It's going to have scratches. It may be, very dirty on the inside. There may be some tears or stains in the upholstery. Cosmetic issues are not as big of a deal if you're looking just for a basic, reliable piece of transportation. Something that has been well maintained is more important than something that has been cleaned up and looks really pretty and shiny, but underneath the hood, it has some issues. So I'm going to take a really quick break, and when I come back, we're going to talk about what you should look for, where to look for it, what you should avoid, and what questions to ask to see if you can find that diamond in the rough and get a decent, inexpensive used car. I'll be right back after this. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a fair price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 888-575-2138. That's 888-575-2138. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Ah, the Car Chick is back for more Straight Shift.
Welcome back to the Straight Shift. We are talking about buying cheap used cars, anything kind of under that $5,000 or $6,000 price range, and why it's extra challenging to find anything decent in that range. So let's talk about what to look for, what not to look for, where to find it, what questions to ask, so that you can weed through all the crap that's out there. Because let me tell you, there's a lot of crap out there, and you need to be able to weed through that to find those gems that have been well cared for, that you can still get at a good price, put a little more money into it to bring it up to snuff, and have yourself a reasonably reliable, inexpensive car. I said before the break not to bother with the dealers. If you're kind of in that $5,000 to $6,000 range, there's some dealers that do a decent job in that price range. Not many, but there are a few. But if you're getting into that, $1, $2, $3, even $4,000 range, you're usually better off looking for a vehicle that's being sold privately. And you're going to find those on Craigslist. Don't bother looking on Auto Trader or Cars.com or any of the big sites, because very few people that are selling super cheap cars will list them there, because you have to pay like 50, 60, 70 bucks, whatever it is these days, to list a car there. And it's just not worth it. So Craigslist is free. Everybody throws that up there. Facebook Marketplace is also becoming a really good place to look for cars. So there are some Facebook groups. In North Carolina, there's one called, it's a really long name, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but it's something like NC Buy and Sell Used Cars and Trucks Under $5,000. It's just something long and crazy like that, but it's a Facebook group. So you might want to look for some Facebook groups around used cars that might be out there. Another place to look is talk to your mechanic. If you have a mechanic that you trust, mechanics will sometimes flip cars. So for example, they'll be working on one of their customers' cars, and that car needs, a new timing belt, or, it just needs some repairs that the owner's like, it's not worth it to me. I'm just going to sell it and get something new. And they call it having the new car light on. And the mechanic may, if they can buy the car cheaply enough from that person, and then they'll do the work that it needs, because they can do that cheaper, obviously, because they're not paying themselves the labor. They can make it a good car, and then, they might keep it for themselves, but often they will flip it. My husband, who's an ASC certified master mechanic and my crew chief, he's awesome. He did this a couple of years ago. He had a customer who had about a 20-year-old Toyota Camry. The miles were relatively low. I think it only had about 140,000 miles on it, but the timing belt broke. And fortunately, that engine is what's called a non-interference engine, which means that when the timing belt breaks, it's not like a bomb going off and your whole engine's destroyed. There were just, a few little things that needed to be fixed up. But it was a 20-year-old car, and she did not want to, spend $1,200-$1,500 to have the timing belt fixed and everything else. She was just ready to buy a new car anyway. So because it was so old, and because it had a broken timing belt, it wasn't going to be worth squat on trade. So we actually purchased it from her for $250. And then David fixed it up, fixed some of the things on the engine that were damaged a little bit and just kind of needed refreshing anyway, put a new timing belt in, a new water pump, and he did a bunch of other stuff to it as well, and made it as perfect as you can make a 20-year-old car. And then we turned around and sold it for, I think, about $3,500 to a lady who needed an inexpensive car for her son. And she knew that, even though Kelley Blue Book said it was only worth a couple $100, she knew all the work that we had done to it, and that because it was going to be much more reliable than anything else she could buy in that price range, that it was worth it to her. So when you're looking at cars in that cheap price range, you're going to see a lot of variance in the years and the mileage, and it's really about what is someone willing to pay for it? What is it worth to them? And anything that runs is worth money these days. So you can throw Kelley Blue Book out the window, but ask your mechanic, ask friends, ask family. They may, you may have a neighbor who was planning to just trade in their old car because they didn't want to go through the hassle of selling it privately, even though they're not going to get squat for it on trade. It's just not worth the pain in the butt factor to them. And they might, sell it to you instead. And then you get a car at a good price. They make a little more money than they would have on trade. It's a win-win. But a lot of cheap used cars never make it onto Craigslist or Facebook because the people just don't want to be bothered with the hassle of selling it privately, and they just trade it to a dealer for pennies on the dollar. So that can be a good option as well. But some things that you want to look for and things to avoid in terms of the cars themselves. Avoid any cars that were pieces of crap when they were new. I am looking at you PT Cruiser and you Chevy Aveo and you Jeep Renegade. There's a whole list of cars that were just bad to begin with, and you can see some of those or hear about some of those. I believe it was episode 20 of The Straight Shift. I did a podcast on the worst used cars in America. So any cars on that list that I give you in that podcast, just don't even bother looking at them. I also recommend avoiding European cars if possible, your Mercedes, your BMWs, even Volkswagens. Now, some people like those cars and, don't mind buying an older Mercedes or an older BMW. If you have the money then to put into it. The reason I say to avoid them is because I'm just going to assume that if you have a small budget, it's because money is tight for you. I totally get it. But European cars are much more expensive to maintain and repair. Their parts are expensive. The labor times are higher. Not every mechanic can work on them. So, those cars are just going to cost a lot more money to maintain. And if you don't have a lot of cash to begin with, you don't want to put yourself in a bad position where you're not going to be able to afford the maintenance on that car going forward, because that's how it's going to stay a reliable piece of transportation for you. So I tell people, if you can find a Toyota or a Honda that's been well cared for, those can be some of your best bets, but it is a double-edged sword. Because Hondas and Toyotas are historically and well known as reliable cars, they command a higher price tag. So a Honda with 250,000 miles may still sell for $3,000 because it's a Honda and it's been well cared for and it runs. Any Honda or Toyota that runs will command some money. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but I'll take a Toyota that's been well maintained that has 200,000 miles on it over a whole variety of American cars that maybe only have 120, 130,000 miles. So that's definitely something to look for. There are even some Hondas out there that have salvage titles that are still selling for, $5,000-$6,000. So they do command the right price, but you still have to make sure that it was well maintained, because even a Honda or Toyota will be a piece of junk if you haven't taken care of it. So when you're out there looking for ads on Craigslist or Facebook or wherever, look for ads where the seller is listing recent maintenance that was done to the car. Does it have new tires? Did they just do the brakes? Does it have a new timing belt? What have they done? As opposed to ads that just say 2005 Ford, 100,000 miles, runs good. You may want to check out another podcast I did, episode 9, how not to buy a used car. That's going to give you some more do's and don'ts and things to avoid in any price range that you're looking for in a used car. And one of the things I say in that, and you will hear me preach this all the time, really one of my rules of car buying is never buy a car without a Carfax. Well, folks, here is going to be the exception to that rule. I'm going to backpedal a little bit, because in this price range, when you're only talking about spending, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 on a used car, the Carfax report is actually the last thing that you should worry about. You may want to pull one at the very end before you sign papers just to make sure there's not a title problem. But honestly, most of the things that you would normally look at and look for on a Carfax report are things that should come up in the pre-purchase inspection, as long as the mechanic really knows what they're doing. If it being a flood car, water damage, if it's been in an accident previously, a good mechanic, a good inspector is going to be able to see those signs on the car and be able to tell you that within a certain amount of certainty. So the Carfax in this price range, save your $35 here and put that towards that pre-purchase inspection, which I'm going to talk about yet again later. But how well the car has been maintained is the single most important factor when you are looking for a cheap used car. It's important across the board, but when you're talking about something older, higher mileage, how gentle have those years and miles been to the car? Has it had regular fluid changes? Has it been garaged? These are things that are going to make it age more gracefully than a car that, has been neglected. If a car hasn't had its oil changes, then there could be a lot of damage in that engine. Your timing tensioner systems could be all gummed up, and that's just a failure waiting to happen and a bomb going off in your engine. If the transmission fluid has not been changed when it is supposed to, then the transmission may start slipping. And next thing you've just bought this car, and then a month later, it now needs a new transmission, or it now needs a new engine, and you've just, blown $2,000. And I'm assuming that you probably don't have $3,000 or $4,000 to replace the transmission or the engine. So that is why how well the car has been maintained is the most important thing. If it's been in an accident, that's not necessarily a deal breaker. It's hard to find an older used car that has not been in at least a fender bender, because people drive like crap these days. But, as long as it hasn't been wrecked to within an inch of its life or badly repaired, if it got in a little bit of fender bender and it was fixed properly, that is not the end of the world. As long as the repairs were done correctly by, a reasonable body shop, don't necessarily just, strike it because of that. Same with cosmetic condition. If it has a couple scratches and scuffs and whatnot, nothing is going to be perfect, as I said before. So just have realistic expectations and know that the maintenance history is the most important thing. So before you even go and look at one of these cars that you might find on Craigslist or Facebook or wherever, you can get on the phone or through email with the seller, and there's a list of questions that you can go through with them to see if it's even worth, driving to wherever they are and taking the time out of your schedule to meet with the person to see the car. Ask them, why are you selling this? Are they selling it because there's a bunch of stuff wrong with it? Are they selling it because somebody in the family passed away? Are they selling it because, I've had this car for 15 years and it's been great and I love it, but, it's time for a new car? Or, we're selling it because, we're having a baby and we need a minivan or an SUV now. Why they're selling it can tell you a lot about the car and whether it's going to be even worth going out and looking at it. Ask them, has the car ever been smoked in? Has it been garaged, or has it been sitting outside the whole time? Do you have maintenance records for it? Where have you done your service? Do you have the title to the car? In this price range, it's going to be very unlikely that there's a lien on the car. And if there is, then probably walk away from it. They should have the title in hand and make sure they actually have it in hand, and not they think they have it, but they haven't actually looked for it. Make sure that they have the title in hand before you go and meet with them, because if they don't have it, then they're going to have to go to the DMV and get a duplicate title, and that'll take a little bit more time. And when you do go see the car, you want them to show you the title so that it's there, it's good, you can see there aren't any liens on it. Just, find out what state it's from, etc. That's just something to look at. That'll also help you, avoid any, stolen cars or internet scammers. There's just a whole bunch of criminals that prey on people looking for cheap cars. It really ticks me off. But then it's time to go out and actually put your hands on the car. Don't ever buy a cheap used car without putting your own hands on it first. I buy used cars for people all over the country, and very often we're buying something sight unseen, but I have a process for that. I always get the Lemon Squad. You can go to lemonsquad.com. It's a company that does nothing but pre-purchase inspections of used cars nationwide. They've been great for me. They're a little more expensive than just taking it to your local mechanic, but they do it on site, and it's totally worth it for the type of used car buying that I am often doing with clients all over the country. But in this cheap price range, go and put your hands on it. Even if it's an hour or 2-hour road trip, it's worth it. You've got to test it out yourself. And there are a lot of things on the car that you can look at yourself that might weed out a few cars so that you're not spending hundreds of dollars on multiple pre-purchase inspections. Save that money until you have evaluated the car as best you can yourself before you then take it to that mechanic. And if you want a list of a very good list of things to look at. I have a free pre-purchase inspection checklist that I created. It is not a substitute for actually going to a mechanic and having a mechanic look it over, but it'll give you a bunch of things to look at when you're touching the car yourself before you decide if it's worth paying that $65 to $100 for a pre-purchase inspection by that mechanic. So to get this free checklist, all you have to do is go to my website, thecarchick.com, scroll down to the little orange bar where my video is, and there's a little opt-in form so you can opt in, and that will sign you up for my newsletter. But don't worry, I'm not going to inundate you with a bunch of emails. I'm actually pretty bad at getting my newsletter out remotely on time anyway, but you will get a lot of really cool free stuff, including my 10 commandments of car buying and this pre-purchase inspection checklist. It goes over, things that you should look at on the outside of the car, things that you should look at on the inside of the car, how to test all of the features of the car, from the radio to the power windows to the navigation system, if there is one, to the windshield wipers. There's a whole list. I think that checklist ended up being about 3, maybe even 4 pages. So there's a lot of stuff there. And those are things that you can test out yourself to find out how well the car operates before you get a mechanic in there to start really tearing under the hood and looking at stuff. It also does give you a bunch of stuff to look at under the hood, though. And another resource for you, I did a video on YouTube a couple of years ago when I was actually putting my hands on an inexpensive used car for one of my clients who just wanted a cheap car for her 16-year-old son. And I just wanted to go put my hands on it before we had a mechanic look at it. And while I was doing that, I'm like, this would make a good video. So my husband got out his cell phone and just started recording me. So you can find that at my YouTube channel. You can go to carchick-tv.com. That URL will actually take you directly to my YouTube channel, or just go to YouTube and search for The Car Chick. And there's a video called How to Buy a Used Car, Basic Used Car Inspection. And that'll walk you through some basics and show you kind of what I found on the cars that I happened to be looking at that day, which were ironically a Honda and a Toyota for my client's son. So hopefully that will help you out. And things that you need to listen for, feel for when you're doing the test drive of the car. Don't just put your hands on it. If, the visual inspection and testing out all the bells and whistles works out okay, definitely drive it around. And if you can, drive it at different speeds. If you can take it on the freeway, you really want to test the car out. How does it idle? How does it go at like 25 to 35 miles an hour? How is it at 45 miles an hour? How is it at highway speeds, 55 to 65 miles an hour? Because you will hear different things and feel different things at different speeds. Test the brakes. Make sure that brake pedal is solid. Make sure you don't feel any vibrations or pulsing in that brake pedal. Listen for weird noises. These are things that can tell you that there's something wrong with the car, even before you take it to a mechanic and you can say, you know what, this car is just not up to snuff and I'm not going to waste my money on a pre-purchase inspection. But let's assume that the test drive went well. It looks like a good car. You think it's a good car. Still take it to that mechanic and get a pre-purchase inspection. You can find, just about any good repair shop will have a pre-purchase inspection process. Like the big chain stores like your Goodyears and your Firestones, they usually have a formal process with a specific formal checklist that they go through and give you. Call up a store near where that car is. If it's a small independent guy or if it's a big chain, don't necessarily take it to the dealership. It's hard to get in with them, and sometimes they'll just tell you it's crap just because they would rather you buy something from them. So definitely do an independent mechanic shop and ask them what their process is. How many things, what all do they check? Do they have a formal checklist form that they use for pre-purchase inspections? And how much is it going to cost? Like I said, you can expect anywhere from $65 to $100 for a pre-purchase inspection, depending on where you live and how thorough that inspection is. If you want to get the Lemon Squad to come out, they'll come out to where the car is. They do the inspection on site. It's convenient. It's a little more expensive there. I think that Andy's at about $150 for those, but they can't do everything. If a mechanic can get the car up on a lift and look underneath it and spin the wheels to, try and detect if there's any broken belts in the tires or anything wrong with the differential, there's just more that they can do when a car's up on a lift. But if that's not possible, Andy's, he owns Lemon Squad. His on-site inspections are really just as thorough as they can possibly be. You get a million pictures, a report. It's great. It is a little bit more expensive, but it can be worth it for you. So even if you're buying from family or a friend that you know really well and trust, that doesn't mean that the car is going to be perfect. Still get that pre-purchase inspection, because they may not know that the car needs some work to it because they haven't noticed, or they haven't heard that noise, or their mechanic just didn't tell them. So always get that pre-purchase inspection. And hopefully this information has been helpful to you if you're in the market for a cheap used car. It's challenging. There's a lot of crap you're going to have to weed through on Craigslist and Facebook. It's going to take time, but if you have a little bit of patience and you're very diligent, you can find a decent ride out there that you can put a little more money into and make it reliable. But of course, the only thing that's going to keep it reliable is if you keep up with that maintenance. I hope this has been helpful, folks. Stay safe out there. I'll see you next time.
The Straight Shift Podcast is copyright LeeAnn Shattuck, the Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of LeeAnn Shattuck or the Car Chick.